think, as those of you who've been coming regularly know, the In Good Faith program is a really important initiative of the Bernardin Center, dedicated to furthering our efforts at interreligious dialogue, and in so doing, strengthening our relationships and deepening our understanding among Jewish, Muslim, and Christian leaders in the Chicagoland area. As many of you are well aware, this year we have made a special effort to include more young people as participants in these sessions. And this evening, we address that particular goal with our speakers as well. We have three remarkable leaders who represent a younger generation, certainly a younger generation than my generation. I'm speaking from my perspective. And they will share their perspectives with us. I'm going to introduce all three of them, have them come up, and then we're going to start with Jacob Cytryn, who's the first person I'm going to introduce. Jacob is the director of Camp Ramah in Wisconsin, an alumnus of the Wexner Graduate Fellowship. Jacob is an advanced Ph.D. student in Jewish Studies and Education in the Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education at Brandeis University, where his dissertation will document and theorize learning at an overnight summer camp. He holds a BA degree in classics from the University of Pennsylvania, an MA in Talmud and Rabbinic Literature from the Jewish Theological Seminary, and has studied in Israel at the Hebrew University, the Conservative Yeshiva, and the Hartman Institute. Jacob recently moved to Chicago with his wife and son. He is a sought-after teacher, writer, and consultant within the Jewish community. In partnership with his family, he pursues his great passion, leveraging Jewish tradition with innovative and excellent educational thinking to promote passionate Jewish communities. Welcome, Jacob. Megan Kennedy-Farrell is the development coordinator at Charis Ministries, which is a Jesuit retreat ministry for young adults in their 20s and 30s. She has over 15 years of experience in youth and young adult ministry, having worked as a postgraduate volunteer at Nazareth Farm in Appalachia, a campus minister at Loyola University here in Chicago, and director of the Peace Builders Initiative right here at Catholic Theological Union. She worked in the Bernardin Center, and so we know her quite well. Megan has a bachelor's degree in social work and English from Augustana College and a Master of Religious Education from Loyola University. She is married and the proud mother of two young children, who also are CTU friends, Maura and Lucas. Laith Saud, our third guest, is a visiting assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies, specifically Islamic World Studies, at DePaul University. His courses include Religion and Politics in the Middle East, Islam in Global Contexts, Introduction to Islamic Studies, the Islamic Experience, and the Catholic-Muslim Encounter. He was a continuing lecturer in the Department of Social Sciences at the Chicago Community College from 2004 to 2009. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Purdue University, a Master of Arts in Social Sciences from the University of Chicago, and he's presently a doctoral student at the University of Chicago in Islamic history. He's a prolific writer, having written numerous articles for mainstream publication as well as contributions to academic journals. He has also made numerous appearances on TV to speak about various Muslim topics. Welcome, Laith. So, what have we asked them to do for us this evening? We've asked them to speak about their experience, broadly focused on these questions. They're simple questions, straightforward questions. What do you do? How did you get where you are? And what have been the most significant influences in the formation of your identity as a leader in your faith community? What might your experience mean for others, especially those of us who might be working with younger people? How have the challenges of a religiously plural environment shaped you as a person of faith and as a leader? And what have you learned from your experience that may be helpful for reflecting on the formation of teens and young adults for leadership in your faith community? So for all of us, what can we learn about forming young people for leadership in our faith communities? So I would ask our speakers to come forward now. We're going to begin with Jacob.
Good evening. Thank you to Sheila. And thanks to everyone from the Bernardin Center for hosting us. Sheila laid out a bunch of questions. I'm going to try to answer the last two and hopefully hit the earlier ones in the process. A little more than a week ago, I was at my parents' house. My parents live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. My father is a pulpit rabbi of a congregation there. And we were joined by one of his dear friends who happens to be a Bible scholar who specializes in Luther and who teaches, I forget, maybe it's Gettysburg Bible College. I forget the specific name. And him and his wife joined us for the Seder. And both nights of the Seder, actually, we had a number of non-Jewish guests with us, and there was an opportunity for interreligious dialogue over the ritual and the meal. And near the very end of the seemingly interminable pre-meal part of the Seder, those of you that have been to Seders know what I'm talking about. Near the end, we come upon really the most haunting and powerful image for me in the whole Passover ritual. The rabbis teach as we conclude retelling the story for the 20th time and turn to the food objects on the table. They tell us that we recite, in every generation, each of us, each Jew, is obligated to see themselves as if they themselves walked out of Egypt. And the challenge of the Passover holiday for us as Jews is to embrace that challenge and that opportunity, and to somehow find ourselves in this ancient narrative, and to redefine the ritual and the narrative around ourselves. And that, I think, is one of the key messages for all of us as we think about this particular topic tonight. I begin with a story about my father because I think that's the story. My father, who was a pulpit rabbi in New Orleans for 10 years and then in St. Louis for a dozen years, and is now finishing up his 10th year in Harrisburg, is both very involved in the secular world and the academic world, and also has made interfaith relations an important and crucial part of his rabbinate from the very beginning. He's actually working on bringing Dr. Amy Jill Levine into Harrisburg in a few weeks, partnering with other colleagues at Dickinson College and in the Christian world as well. My father is of a generation. He was born in 1952, graduated high school at the height of the late 60s era. He wasn't at Woodstock because he was on an Israel trip that summer. And he was brought up loving Mickey Mantle and Jerry Garcia and Bob Dylan, and also fell in love in college and then in graduate school with knowledge. The child he's a third generation American, somewhat unusual, not so unusual for Jews of his age living in America. The son of a doctor and a nurse who met during World War II. My dad fell in love with this pluralistic society of America. And that is the society in which I grew up. In his massive library that grows larger every month when he brings home 10 or 15 books from Barnes & Noble, The Anchor Bible Commentary is as prominent as any of the Jewish Bible commentaries that might exist on his shelves. He was always looking for the next big idea, whatever that might be. And in his teaching, and indeed in the household in which I was raised, that type of intellectual discourse was of the highest priority, and I drank at that fountain from a very young age. Our community in New Orleans, Louisiana, one can imagine, not so many Jews in New Orleans. At the time, in the 1980s, after the oil bust, but well before Katrina, there were about 12,000 Jews in the metropolitan area. And I grew up knowing I was Jewish and very actively involved in the Jewish community, and yet at the same time, it was impossible for me to go anywhere and not see non-Jews, right? Especially Lent, Mardi Gras, Easter, Christmas. This is New Orleans. And the Catholic community there clearly exceptionally strong. The community in New Orleans was a synagogue and a group of young families who also helped to raise me that also really shaped me. Many of them were transplanted Northeasterners, cosmopolitan Jews who had come to who had come to New Orleans from New York often for a career in law or medicine or business or the academy, and who created a synagogue that was anti-hierarchical, that believed in progress, that was committed from its founding to an egalitarian approach to men's and women's issues in the synagogue, even as the conservative movement, of which I'm a part, was being ravaged for decades by these questions. That was a synagogue that was very much on the left, quite progressive, and quite embracing of those possibilities for change. When I was 10, my parents moved us to St. Louis. And St. Louis was not such a good fit for the family, and especially not for me. And within a year or two, the only thing my parents could respond with when I complained that they had moved us to St. Louis was that had they not moved me to St. Louis, I wouldn't have met my camp friends. So you could only imagine as a 13 or 14-year-old enjoying 8 weeks over the summer at Camp Ramah-Wisconsin, where I'm now privileged to be the director. That, for my parents, was the only saving grace they could identify for having moved the family to St. Louis. I've spent the last 21 summers at Camp Ramah-Wisconsin. This will be my first as the director of the camp. And in many ways for me, it's the story of 2 decades. The first 10 years at Ramah, I fell in love with everything there was to fall in love with about the camp. It became an intellectual playground and a professional playground for me as an educator. It allowed me, and this is something I'll come back to later, it allowed me at a very young age to play adult roles in the community. We ran our own religious services. We had intense discussions facilitated by really old 18 or 19-year-olds in a circle on the grassy knoll in front of our dining hall on Shabbat afternoons. Those were our experiences. We talked of revolution in our cabins. I orchestrated a massive water balloon fight at 3 o'clock in the morning to celebrate one of our friends who had to go home a few days before the end of the summer. And those were the great moments for me and for us and for my group of friends. The second 10 years at camp, where I served as a counselor, a division head, and then on the year-round staff as the program director and assistant director, were much more difficult for me. In many ways, the exciting things about Judaism I no longer saw at camp. I saw outside of camp. I was exposed to pluralistic institutions, consciously constructed pluralistic places. I was exposed to the beginnings of some kind of interreligious dialogue. I was exposed to high-level intellectual thinking. And camp was the place that held on to me. It became, in many, many ways, my home. And at the same time, I felt like I had kind of outgrown it. And so I spent the rest of the year nurturing my spiritual self, being excited, mostly by progressive and liberal ideas in the Jewish community and elsewhere, and then coming back to camp and trying, almost always unsuccessfully, to implement them in the ways that I had wanted to. And as I think about embarking on my third decade at this intensely educational Jewish summer camp, I think about trying to bring that Jewish world that I fell in love with over the last decade into the camp. Camp Ramah-Wisconsin, in its era, was one of the most progressive and status quo challenging institutions in the 50s and 70s, if at no other time, and I hope to bring some of that back. Where were these institutions? Chiefly, I'll talk about four. There's an organization of Jews called Encounter. Encounter runs trips for North American Jewish leaders studying or visiting in Israel into parts of the West Bank to meet with the local Palestinian community, almost exclusively nonviolent activists of that community, in an attempt not to foster a particular political solution to the challenges in the Middle East, but to try and reshape the dialogue in the North American community, because in general, Jews and Palestinians do not speak to each other. And so they bring us, I've gone now on 3 different trips. I spent the night in the home of a lovely Catholic family in Bethlehem about 5 years ago. There are many Christian Muslim stories here as well about the dynamics in those communities in the West Bank and the Holy Land as well. And they are working systematically to alter the dialogue, to try to change the status quo, because in the Jewish community internally, I will say in this space, we can't have the conversations that we need to have about Israel and its direction for the future. There's another organization, the American Jewish World Service. The American Jewish World Service it does Jewish work in what they call the Global South, what many of us would recognize better as the Third World. And I went on a 10-day trip to a rural Mayan village in the Yucatan, Muchacuchca, a year and a half ago, and was able to experience with other graduate students the profound impact of that kind of development work, partnership with grassroots NGOs on the ground, and that kind of expression of what it means to be a Jew. I met my wife at an amazing educational institution in New York City called the Abraham Joshua Heschel School. My wife is a founding member of the faculty and administration at the high school, and I joined the faculty for 3 years shortly after I finished college. And the Heschel School is a consciously pluralistic Jewish school that embraces the pluralism of its Jewish students in its teaching and attempts to in all sorts of other ways as well. Finally, I will nod. The Jewish community, I assume this is true of other faith communities, though I don't really know. The Jewish community, in many ways, is supported and energized by amazing philanthropists. And one of the towering philanthropists is a man named Leslie Wexner. Leslie Wexner is the chairman and founder of the Limited Brands. He founded a little company with a $5,000 loan from his father that allegedly had a limited selection. So he called it The Limited. And today he's worth several $billion. And he sponsors 3 prominent Jewish leadership programs, one of which I was privileged to be a part of, and the alumni community is now quite active. The Wexner Foundation brings together Jews from the far right to the secular left, academics, rabbis, educators, lay leaders, Israeli civil servants, and brings them together to think and teach about leadership and what it means to be leaders in today's world. As I mentioned earlier, for me, as I reflect back, I want to try to deconstruct my own narrative with 4 lessons. The first is the human element in identity formation. whether at a summer camp, a school, a mosque, a church, a synagogue, the people matter. And whether those role models are a few years older, peers, or much older. I began my story with my father. There are many others, countless others, that I can think of that have helped shape me along the way. The second is the institutional. It's not just about the human, it's about consciously crafting and creating an institutional culture that fosters what I would suggest needs to be an intellectually honest relationship with the outside world that's invested in the theory, but most importantly, has significant ramifications and is in dialogue with the practical. Because that's how we grow. So close to the University of Chicago, that's how Dewey would have designed it. Invested in the theory, but very much grounded in the practical. Thirdly, the educational side. There has to be both a vision of the type of human being we want our children and young adults to be, and again, that has to be intellectually honest. And in addition to that vision of who we want them to be when they grow up, we also need a vision of how they're going to get there. Right? I'll give you an example. Slightly touchy example. In the conservative movement, I'm a conservative Jew. I'm a conservative Jewish leader. I am unaware of a sexual ethic written by the conservative movement that is in any way compelling in the last 3 decades. And so, try to be Catholic. And so, our campers come to camp, and they know that they come to camp, and their parents and their counselors hope that they'll meet their spouse at camp. And everything that happens between the moment they meet and the moment, God willing, that they stand under the chuppah, the marriage canopy, and get married, we don't know how to talk about. We don't know how to frame for them. That entire piece, that crucially important part of growing up, the interpersonal, the romantic, the sexual, yes, all of that we kind of leave blank. And that's a shame, and it's something that I'm committed to working on. I want to go back to my initial framing. We were sharing earlier, before dinner. I've been reading a lot about the Pope, Benedict, his legacy, his choice. Francis, Newsweek has been writing tons and tons of articles about the Catholic Church. And one of the things that I mentioned in this dialogue, and I think it's compelling and I hope it's helpful to people, one of the lessons of the Passover Seder is that in every generation, we have to see ourselves as if we left Egypt. And that means that in every generation, we're going to see ourselves differently than the prior generation did. My grandparents' generation of conservative Jews were obsessed with Judaism's obsession with rebuilding the temple. And so they stripped all of our conservative liturgy of as many allusions to the temple as they could. And not a single person of my generation cares one iota about that language or about those changes that they made. It just does not resonate. For my parents' generation, the women's issue was paramount. For my generation, there's homosexuality that we talk about, there's the Israel situation, there's Judaism's relationship to the global south or the third world. There are new hot topic issues. And you never know what the next generation is going to seize on as their cause célèbre. You never know. And that to me is one of the lessons here, and that we need to work on cultivating communities that allow for that rebellion and that dialogue while still developing a sound basis for religious development as well. Thank you.
Well, good evening, and I too offer my gratitude for the invitation to be here. It really has been a gift over the last few weeks to reflect on some of the significant moments. I'm gonna watch my time here. Significant moments in my life. And I feel like my life has been really deeply blessed to have the opportunity to claim my faith as an adult and to connect to both an ancient and a living tradition. But if you had told me when we got the kind of the text and the thoughts about tonight, one of the things Scott in particular talked about was wanting people for whom their 20s weren't too far in the distant past. But if you had told me in my early 20s that I would be invited to speak on this topic to this group of people, you would have gotten a very perplexed look. This is not what I planned for my life. I don't think I even had a vision that what I have been doing with my life for the last 15 years existed. I had never heard the words lay ecclesial ministry, and I'm pretty sure if I did, they wouldn't have sounded very inviting or appealing. And yet, this is my life. And for the last 15 years, I've worked in ministry and primarily with youth and young adults who have been exploring their own place in the church. And so I want to share a bit of my experience and what seemed to sort of gel as I thought back through what has been maybe most significant for me, but also because my journey and my ministry has been with youth and young adults. If in fact these reflections contain any wisdom, they also come from the young people that I've worked with. In many ways, they have been, I think, my greatest teachers and very much an inspiration to me. But in particular, when I thought about my journey and how I've gotten to where I am and why I'm doing what I'm doing, there were kind of two contrasting images from my life that came to my mind. The first was from 1994. I was a college junior, and I studied abroad in Latin America for the fall quarter. I went to a small college, and the faculty traveled with us, and they taught the classes while we were there. I have no idea why I decided to sign up for this exactly, except that it sort of fit in the program. The other options were to travel to Europe, and I forget what the third place was even now, Asia. So there was, each year it kind of, the courses rotated. And I think a lot of the things that when I think about in my life, I think seem like happenstance. But from where I stand and what I believe the Spirit has been at work in this. So this was a very powerful experience for me. It was the first time I had traveled out of the country. We visited 5 different countries: Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile. It was a very eye-opening, very life-giving experience. But when I look back, I also feel like there was an aspect to that experience that was rather flat. We studied geography and literature and writing across cultures, but nothing about economics or politics or the place of Latin America in the global context, and certainly nothing about a people who had struggled through revolution, who had struggled with hope, and who had worked for justice. And in hindsight, I think that I knew something was missing, but I had no idea what the questions were. And now fast forward to the other image. Forward 6 years. It's the year 2000. I'm now a campus minister working at Loyola University, Chicago, working on my master's degree in religious education and taking a group of students to El Salvador on a 10-day alternative break experience. And here we lived with families who were willing to share their stories of war and loss, struggle and survival. I had the opportunity to meet Father John Cortina, a Jesuit priest who survived the massacre at the University of Central America because that night he happened to not be at the university, but instead out in the campo working with the poor community that he worked with regularly. We also visited the graves of the Maryknoll Sisters, the U.S. church women who were killed in the early 80s for their work on behalf of justice and peace. And in this experience, that sort of flat moment that I talked about from my fall quarter studying abroad, that black and white photo came into full, vibrant color for me. And I encountered people and communities of faith who believed fervently in a God of justice, resurrection, and hope. And the God of my catechism textbooks suddenly came to life. So as I thought about kind of what happened between 1994 and 2000, if I kind of had to boil it down, I had some kind of deep innate hunger in my own life to live meaningfully. And for me, in its simplest form, as a late adolescent, that meant being in relationship with others and trying to make the world a better place. And my life brought me in contact with people who were doing this with great joy and hope, as well as with a deep and sustained commitment. And they were people of faith. Many of them happened to come from the tradition that I had been raised in. And so when I sort of think back and put it all together, I would say that when I found these people and I found what they were doing with their lives, I found what I didn't know I had been looking for up until that point. So I tried to kind of think about what happened that might be relevant for those of us who care about young people today. And as an anecdote, I happened to be meeting at a foundation this afternoon with the president of the foundation who was funding our work at Charis, and he started to talk about his 4 young children and the deep concerns that he has for them and their faith life. And we shared quite a bit about the pain of what is involved in being Catholic today. He talked very openly about, what his children see when they look at a church that has been embroiled in the abuse, the scandal and the abuse of young children, and yet to apologize or take responsibility for that. And how do we ask young people to give their lives to a community and a tradition for which that is so real? And so I have, my own experiences, but also a deep heart and I'm deeply in touch with, I think, the pain of that for so many. And I don't want to simplify this beyond that. I think it's difficult in many ways. But for me, there were kind of 4 important lessons that I pulled out of my own story. First is I've spent a lot of my time working with and being formed in the Jesuit world. And now, thanks to Pope Francis, I don't have to explain all the time what that means. People at least have heard the word Jesuit. But part of Ignatian spirituality talks about the preference for experiencing God rather than learning about God. There was apparently once a cartoon about this that had 2 doors. One said God, one said discussions of God, and the line was out the door for discussions of God, and no one was waiting in line at the door that said God. Because, of course, it's much easier to talk about God than to encounter God. But for me, when I was a high school student, and I left out a lot of my sort of early upbringing, but I was a pretty typical cradle Catholic. We went to church every Sunday. There was no discussion about it. There wasn't that much discussion about it either, if you know what I mean. We went, and that was sort of that. But my mom was very involved in our parish, and as a result of those relationships, I was invited to be part of my high school youth ministry and to be in a leadership position, not because I was known, but because she was, and maybe that's how it works sometimes. But as a result of being a part of that youth program, as a high school junior, I spent a week in Appalachia at a place called Nazareth Farm. And this was a very significant experience in my life. This was the first time, I think, that I really thought about what I wanted to do with my life or was invited to do. When I was thinking about this, I thought, well, except for when I was a child and I was fascinated with fashion plates and I thought I would be a fashion designer. But once I really, as an adult, thought more seriously about what I wanted to do, this was the first place where that happened. And it happened in large part because I encountered a group of young people who were living and working in community in this rural part of Appalachia. They had given a year, 2 years, 3 years of their time to live and work amongst people who were poor and elderly, who were in need of the basics of food, clothing, and shelter. And there was something so alive in that community of young people, something that I had never seen or felt or encountered before. And I still have an incredibly vivid memory of the moment that I sort of realized that there was something very powerful happening in front of me. And I can still sort of feel that place in my heart that I think really kind of burned at that time. I was deeply moved by this community's relationship with each other, the way that they talked about God, but mostly by the relationships that they had with people in the community who were poor, elderly, and in need. I was fascinated and intrigued by what they were giving their lives to. And I was later reminded of this experience when I was working as the director of the Peace Builders Initiative, and a young high school student came back after spending a day working with Little Brothers, Friends of the Elderly, and she was reflecting to me about the power of a staff member and the relationships that he had with the elders, and what it meant, what it was like for her to witness someone else living out their vocation. I remember how she expressed wanting to live that way and wanting to make that kind of an impact on others. So Nazareth Farm remained a very powerful and important place for me. And when I graduated from college, I had a scholarship to get a master's degree in social work from Washington University in St. Louis. And I went on a camping trip with some friends in the Smoky Mountains, which are also part of the Appalachian Mountain Range. And I laid in a tent one night and I could not sleep. And I thought, I don't want to go to St. Louis. I don't want to study social work. I want to go back to West Virginia and back to Nazareth Farm. And I thought, I'll come to my senses in the morning, but I never did. So that was the first, I don't think I ever have really, but that first really true experience of feeling called to something, although I would not have used that language. It was like something in my gut that was telling me what to do. And I did. And I moved to West Virginia, and I joined that community that I had romanticized in many ways, and suddenly that life became real. But as it turned out, it held nearly as much power when lived in real life as it did as a high school student observing, and it changed my life. And so from that, I think the learning that I would take from that in terms of what this might mean for other young people is that I really believe we have to experience God. And experience what a life of meaning and faith in action might look like. Secondly, I took the time in the last week to poll a number of my former students who I think are doing incredible things with their lives and ask them if you could name just one thing that you think has led to your being where you are today, what would it be? And almost every one of them talked about people, the people that they had met, the models and the witnesses that they had. And for me, this is true in two significant ways. As a college student, so I attended a small Lutheran school, and at that time, some of my very close female friends were studying religion and theology and preparing for seminary. My roommate's mother was a pastor, and suddenly all kinds of questions started to come for me about what it might mean to be in professional ministry as a woman and what the obstacles were to that as a Catholic. I became very involved in the women's studies program. I took all kinds of women's studies classes, and I stopped going to church. I felt like there was no way I could possibly sit in my women's studies class on Wednesday and this patriarchal church on Sunday. And so I only went to church when I was with my parents because it was easier than explaining myself. And then my senior year of college, the Catholic chaplain, the priest, was moved, and the diocese didn't have another priest to replace him. And so instead, a sister of St. Benedict became our Catholic chaplain. And to this day, when I introduce her to people, I say I think she is the reason that I am still Catholic today. I was a public school kid, so I didn't meet many of the incredible sisters that I have since met in my life as a young child. But Sister Marilyn was a feminist and a Catholic. She was willing to engage and talk about the things that we weren't supposed to talk about the Catholic Church. And she was, for me, the first model of someone who bridged different worlds and who could live her life authentically in the midst of seeming inconsistencies. And that was hugely significant for me, that somehow I could find a way to be Catholic and feel what I felt as a woman. And now, as I've grown older, there are so many other things that I could add to that list in terms of the things that feel inconsistent in this human community, the things that in our human construct of church don't always seem to me to fit with and be at peace with what I read in the scriptures, or the vibrant community that I am a part of that doesn't match the communities that are described in the media. She was the first person that told me that it was okay to live in the midst of that, and that it was okay to continue to work for the reign of God on earth today while everything in front of us maybe didn't look that way. And I think when I think about young people today, I think figuring out how to be authentic in the midst of inconsistency is very significant. The second group of models and witnesses I had, I met when I moved back to Chicago and became very connected to the activist justice work that was happening here in Chicago. And so the folks who work at the Eighth Day Center for Justice, for example, and others. And I think at this point, I was convinced that I wanted to live a meaningful life. I felt called to try to make the world a more just place. And truly, as I looked around, the people that I encountered who I thought were doing that work with the most joy and the most hope, and who had the most evidence of a long-term sustained commitment to that work were people of faith. And I happened to encounter a lot of Catholics in that. And so for me, it was like finding a home. It was finding people who were living out of the tradition that I had grown up with, but again, it kind of finally coming to life. And these people became like colleagues to me. And in this case, many of these mentors were not my peers or even close to my peers. People much older, many generations older than me, and yet we became like one. We worked together, and they shared their lives with me, but they also were just witnesses to what it meant to live my faith out loud. I think young people today hunger for community and for mentorship. Fourth, I went to CCD, catechism class, every Saturday of my upbringing. I cannot tell you one thing that I learned from that experience. It was not a profound experience. It was not a powerful experience. I was sort of in that gap, post-Vatican II, but before we had figured out what to really teach young people. But I'm wondering, even if that had been figured out, what that educational experience would have been like for me. I think for me, what was important in terms of learning is that I first had to have an experience of God. And so for me, I went to graduate school because someone offered me a full tuition scholarship to study in the religious education program at the Institute of Pastoral Studies. And I thought that I wanted to teach high school religion and do high school campus ministry. I had no idea really what that meant. It was the full tuition scholarship that got me. But that's where I learned about my tradition. So I'm now in my 20s, and I've done all of these other things, and I've thought that I want to teach religion, but it's only here that I finally come to learn anything about my tradition. Where I learned what a Eucharistic theology is about, where I learned who Dorothy Day was. And I think that, for me, in the Catholic tradition, we put a lot of resources into the education of young children and very little into the education of young adults and older adults. And I wonder about kind of reprioritizing that a bit, that once there is an experience of God, then to put the education, the tradition, and the intellect, not that one has to exclude the other, but we're missing that part. And for me, that was very powerful, to finally be able to learn those things in dialogue with an experience that had preceded that learning. And finally, I feel incredibly lucky to have found a parish where I can live my faith and be church today. I drive 45 minutes to get there and probably pass 70 Catholic churches along the way. I don't know how many, but it's very important for me to be able to be church in the midst of this. And it's very difficult, I think. right now in my faith tradition to find a place where that works. I know I'm running out of time, so just to say that I don't think that there's anything really magical about my experience, but I think for those of us who care about our traditions, who care about leadership in our faith communities and the lives of young people within these communities, maybe there is some invitation, some elements perhaps of a job description for us. So just a couple things to end with. First, I want to say that young people in our culture do have so many options and so many perceived choices. But I think despite what the media tells us, it's very important for us to remember that young people hunger for connection. They hunger for meaning. And for me, that hunger was my starting point. And there were experiences and people that nurtured that, and I wouldn't be where I am today without that. Secondly, I think it's important that we invite young people now, today, to use the gifts that they have in the present tense, not down the road someday when they get a certain degree or have a certain experience or get things figured out. Third, I think it's very important, from my experience anyway, to involve young people in the mission of the faith, not just the discussion of it, but its actual lived out expression. I think maybe most importantly, as older adults, our job is to bear witness to what is life-giving about our faith. I didn't have enough time to talk about sort of many of the journeys that I had with people who came from different traditions. My very best friend growing up is Jewish, and I think with her knowledge and understanding of her faith allowed me to ask questions about my own. The hordes of Lutherans that I went to college with who asked me all the time to explain the saints. I mean, anytime that we put ourselves in conversation with others, we learn more about ourselves or have a desire to learn more. But what I think is most important is that young people see adults who are bearing witness to what is life-giving about their faith. And then I think it's important that we not be afraid of their questions, that we not be afraid if they journey away for some time. But if there's something that is life-giving, they will find it if, in fact, they're looking for it. So I'll stop there in the interest of time and say thank you and hope that we can continue the conversation.
Good evening, everyone. You guys hear me okay? All right. First, I'd like to thank the CTU, or the Catholic Theological Union, for inviting us. I'd like to thank Jacob and Megan. I actually didn't get a chance to meet you guys yet. I'll be sure to get to know you guys even more after the discussion. I also see people in the audience like Mr. Frederick Galdine and Abdul Malik in the back. I didn't get a chance to say hi to you guys, but I look forward to meeting those of you who I do not know and haven't got a chance to speak to yet. Also, I'd like to thank Scott and Sheila and Janet, who I don't see where she is right now, for inviting me, and we look forward to an engaging discussion afterwards. Well, as was said before, my name is Laith Saud. I'm a visiting assistant professor at DePaul University. I guess I'm the Muslim on the panel, and sometimes these kind of setups are strange to me, you know, a Jew, a Catholic, and a Muslim on the panel, and you're waiting for the punchline, right? It's just waiting for a joke to begin, but this is nice. I've heard some very fulfilling stories, and what was most fulfilling to me was listening to them is the similarities between their lives and my own. So I will try not to be redundant and repeat those similarities, but there's aspects of my life that are also unique, but at the same time similar to a lot of Muslims, and I hope that can bear some understanding for where Muslims are coming from today. So one thing that was not mentioned in my bio is that I'm an activist. And I'm very involved in the Muslim community here in Chicago on an intellectual level, but particularly on a social justice level. And social justice, and this is not at all unique to Islam, we see it in Judaism, we see it in Catholicism as well, is imparted upon us by the tradition. It's a very fundamental part of the tradition. And if somebody were to ask me what are the pillars of Islam, sure, we ramble off the common five, but I would argue that good works, or khair al-amal, or the pursuit of social justice should be up there with the rest. It's an absolute imperative upon Muslims to pursue social justice. In the context of this world and all of the injustice we see, it's a paramount feature of my life. So I think that's probably what brought me up here rather than the academic stuff or teaching at DePaul or TV or radio or whatever else. So allow me to begin with what's influenced me the most and who has influenced me the most. I was born in Baghdad, Iraq in 1978, and came here as a child when I was about a year old. So I'm an Iraqi American. That is not an easy identity to have. My father, like Jacob's father, is a religious leader. He is the president of the Fort Wayne Shura, or the Fort Wayne Islamic Council, and a khatib at the local mosque. And I, like Jacob, was exposed to a wonderful library as a kid in which there were books on Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, and I devoured those as a young person. But then, when I was about 12 years old, I say but in addition to that life, when I was around 12 years old, the first Gulf War happened. And you can imagine I'm at an age where I'm transitioning from being a child to being a younger adult, if you will. I was exposed for the first time to the dissonance between media and points of view. Media and a more global perspective of events. When I was a kid and the first Gulf War happened, it was televised. And as a kid, I was watching the city of my birth bombarded by the country of my life. And it's to be on the margins. It's to be on the outside looking in. And I think it's a somewhat flattering thing to be asked to talk about your life, right? And how did you get to this place through your life? And if I had to sum it up, it would be from the outside looking in, to be somebody on the margins. So when I was 12 years old, my father used to do the local media in Fort Wayne, which is not big, and I find myself now at 34 years old doing the same thing he was doing when I was 12. So there's a certain sort of consistency in that, and a consistency I don't know if should be comforting or discomforting. But nonetheless, it's a consistency that runs through my father's generation to my own, and as I can tell, perhaps my generation to my 11-year-old daughters, and those of our community that live in that generation. So when I was 12 years old, I was listening to what was happening in the war in my home, as well as talking to people in Baghdad on the phone, while we were watching a different scenario play out on television. And I'm not here to tell you that the scenario on television was false and our scenario was the truth. However, I was exposed at a very young age to the complexity of things, and that never to presume, just because something is authoritative, because it's on television or on radio, that it's the entire story. There's always more to the story. And this being on the margins is somewhat of an epistemological theme of my life. There is a very prominent scholar in Islamic studies who actually conducted historical research from the margins by looking at, and Scott knows exactly what I'm referring to, by looking at how would minorities view Islamic history? How would those sort of outside of the so-called mainstream of view the narrative of Islamic history and civilization? And he found it to be a very fruitful endeavor. I guess I've sort of borrowed that paradigm for myself in an effort to sort of understand how I see things from the margins and how I see things from the outside. And there's a great deal of solidarity between me and a few close friends who are also activists in the community. And we sort of revel in this, that we see things from a different perspective. For a long time, it can be considered somewhat burdensome. And it is, and if I could borrow an analogy, it's our own cross to bear. When you're constantly seeing things from a different perspective, yet the orthodox media, if I can use that term, and substitution of the mainstream media, is constantly marginalizing those points of view to extreme ends or outside of the picture altogether. And when you're alone in the wilderness, and you're the only one seeing things a certain way, that can be difficult. But when you're able to engage with others in your community that also see things that way, it can be quite fulfilling. and there can be a missionary aspect to it. And it's been my wonderful experience to see that it's not only my fellow Muslims that have that point of view, but it's something that's shared by others who are critical, who are outside of the Muslim community, Catholics, Jewish. I don't think it's a mistake that the Jewish community was at the cutting edge of the civil rights movement throughout the 1950s and 1960s and earlier than that. Why? Because it's a community that's been cultivated at the margins, constantly a minority, constantly having to look at things critically without having to simply accept the orthodoxy that's been imparted upon them. And I can recall the famous late Edward Said commenting that he was the last Jew. If you knew he was a Palestinian Christian, you would understand the irony of what he was saying. What he was saying is that to be a person in exile doesn't afford you the comfort of accepting things as they're given to you, but rather you have to constantly challenge things. And to be the wandering intellectual or the wandering activist, to never quite feel at home wherever you are, facilitates a kind of discomfort in which you can look at things with constantly critical eyes. And that has been somewhat of my intellectual genealogy and my intellectual lineage. So my father has influenced me the most insofar as I can see my life following his steps. And also because of his insistence, a very Islamic principle, by the way, but his insistence on speaking truth to power. And the greatest jihad in Islam is the jihad to speak truth to power. And of course, that's become a demonized word in this society because it's a largely misunderstood word. But when I say to you that the greatest jihad in Islam is to speak to truth to power, you should understand the gist or the spirit of what jihad means. What jihad means, it means to struggle for a certain improvement towards the moral good. And watching my father grow up, or watching my father do this in Indiana, of all places, it was particularly enlightening for me. So as I was preparing my comments for today, and I was looking over the sheet in which they wanted us to answer these various questions, I came to this one. How important have the challenges of a religiously plural environment shaped you as a person of faith and as a leader? I didn't come from a religiously plural environment. Indiana, most people who have a German background, most people were Protestant. In fact, when I came to Chicago, I was shocked at how many Catholics there were. I couldn't believe how Catholic this town was. And teaching at DePaul University, I often ask and it's a Catholic university, but, still, I was thinking, I asked my students, how many Catholics in here? So many raised their hand. This is not the environment I grew up in. I grew up in an environment in which I was a Muslim. Everybody else around me was blonde-haired, blue-eyed Christian, right? For the most part. I'm embellishing slightly, but for the most part. And what did it mean to be a Muslim in Indiana in the 1980s and the 1990s? For the most part, to be a Muslim, and I don't mean this in any pejorative sense, or I don't mean to marginalize the traditions I'm about to compare them to. I'll explain in a moment. But to be a Muslim was to be a Buddhist or a Hindu. You were from over there, Oh, you're one of those Eastern people. And they don't know much else besides that. Maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. I'll tell you, it was certainly easier to be the unknown rather than the demonized known of today, which for the most part was what Muslims are. And I'll give you an anecdote in that respect. My daughter's 11. When she was 6 or 7 years old, we were visiting my parents' house. Still live in the same house. And across the street is an evangelical family. So my 7-year-old was playing with the 6-year-old girl from across the street. The 6-year-old proceeded to tell my daughter, who was 7, your religion is inspired by the devil, and you need to accept Christ as your Savior. Now, I can tell you that never would have happened to me in the 1980s or the 1990s when I was growing up in Indiana. Most people didn't know, no pun intended, what the hell I was, all right? They wouldn't bother with it. Christ, this guy probably has a dot on his head, or, he's looking for nirvana. A whole bunch of jumbled illusions in a very sort of superficial approach to the Eastern traditions. Now, Islam is an Abrahamic faith. Islam ascribes to the same prophetic line as does Judaism and Christianity to an extent, right? It extends in Islam to Muhammad, but Jesus is a prophet in Islam, Moses is a prophet in Islam, David is a prophet, obviously Abraham is a prophet, so on and so forth. So the alienation, the sense that on the one hand, for years, you're sort of an unknown minority, and then after the first Gulf War, then of course 9/11, you become an intensely scrutinized one, has been the trajectory of not just my life, but many Muslims' lives. And I think that is probably different than maybe my fellow panelists. Maybe, but I could be wrong. So from the first Gulf War, I developed a very acute sense of being critical. And it was something I carried on through high school, and I continued to carry on through college. And I had all kinds of dreams about being a writer. I was going to be a novelist. And I even moved to California when I got out of high school. I didn't go straight to college. I'm going to make movies, and I'm going to write novels, and it's an artistic streak, which I still actually maintain to this day. But then I came to my senses, and I said, I want to get away from this stuff. I think I just want to go into business and get a job, and I don't want to think so much, right? Then 9/11 happened, and like Al Pacino in The Godfather, I got pulled right back in, right? It's imperative upon us, at least in the way I was raised, and at least in the way I was taught my tradition, it was imperative upon me to speak out. It was imperative upon me to push back on the mainstream narrative. It was imperative upon me to speak out against the second Gulf War that took place in 2003. And I don't mean to offend you if you disagree with me in that respect, yet I will stand here and confidently tell you I feel vindicated in that respect. Because looking back at the last 10 years and how the events of the Iraq War have unfolded and how certain political things have come to light, I do feel vindicated. And I hope, it is my sincere hope, not just as a Muslim but as an American, that we can arrive to some rational place where we can accept that, yeah, we got it wrong. And we need to accept that as a community together. And if we can't do that together, because we wish to remain partisan or whatever the case may be, then we can't move forward in fixing a lot of our other problems, domestic or otherwise. So it's a hope that I sincerely maintain. But like I said, I didn't grow up in a religiously plural place, but I certainly live in a religiously plural place now. And how has religious pluralism affected my religiosity, if you will? One thing, if you believe in God in any way, shape, or form, you have to reconcile your belief with the reality around you, right? There's two ways of doing that. You can either condemn those around you who don't share your particular tradition as going to hell or being damned or not being saved or being ignorant or whatever your condemnation should entail. But that's some kind of God. That's not a God that I'd feel comfortable having a relationship to. The other way to do it is to understand that this complexity is part of the fabric of creation itself, and that you need to learn from it. And as it in fact says in the Quran, I made you into nations and various groups to learn from one another. So the pluralism, to me, compelled me to have to look deep into my own tradition and search for the nuance that allows it to be compatible, fluid, harmonious with the world as I live it, with my world here in the United States. That those Islamic principles that resonate and contribute to the society that I share in have to be the Islamic principles that I maintain, that I articulate, and that I'm most vocal about. And I'm not one to suggest that all Muslims all over the world need to practice Islam in the same way. I think it's a little bit strange and unbecoming of ourselves as Americans when we like to elevate our own status as a society by comparing ourselves to Afghanistan. Or when we like to say, look how bad Islam is, look at the way Afghans practice Islam. Afghan society is a byproduct of Afghan society. It's a byproduct of an agrarian society that is still largely tribal, so on and so forth, in particular historical developments. I'm not interested in practicing Islam as an Afghan does here in the United States, nor am I interested in insisting that we in the United States tell people in Afghanistan how they should be practicing their religion. I'm all for dialogue. I'm against impositions. I'm against forcing people to do anything. And we know that the banner of enlightenment has too often been flown on behalf of ventures and adventures that are either imperialistic or very poorly thought out. So my religious identity has constantly informed a political tone and a political narrative, and that maintains to this day. Is that always going to be the case? I'm not sure. Part of me hopes not. Part of me hopes that I can get to a place one day with a quiet spirituality in which you can meditate and pray and fast and do those things. And you could stay away out of the public controversies of politics, which are not very rewarding, but absolutely necessary from the tradition that I come from. So, the last thing I'd like to address is what have I learned? Being somebody, I'm 34, not far from my 20s, what does my own experience tell me about what the experiences of those perhaps 10 to 15 years younger than me will go through? All I can do is encourage you to do this. Keep an ear out for the voices on the margins. Hear what they have to say. They may not be correct, but they have a point of view that most of us do not have the luxury of having. And what I would say to my fellow Muslims who constantly feel that they are on the margins and feel besieged by their particular identity in this world today, or at least in this society right now, take pride in it. It's a duty, and it's also something that cultivates a sharper intellect and thicker skin. And to be a Muslim in the United States today, you got to have those two things. So, thanks.